The morning air hung crisp and heavy over Oakhaven Farm, a sprawling estate etched into the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. Elias Thorne, a man hardened by solitude and loss, approached his barn with a familiar weariness. What awaited him inside, however, was anything but familiar. It was an event so bizarre, so contrary to the natural order, that it would shatter his carefully constructed world and send ripples of disbelief through the small, close-knit community. Elias, a man known for his stoicism and detachment, found himself confronted with the impossible. Nestled amongst the litter of his loyal Labrador Goldie lay not another puppy but a human infant, small, fragile, and undeniably human. The discovery sent a shockwave through Elias, a man who had long since resigned himself to a life devoid of such startling surprises. The news, as such things often do in small towns, spread like wildfire. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to outright exclamations of disbelief. How could such a thing be? How could an animal give birth to a human child? The questions mounted, fueled by speculation and a healthy dose of rural mystique. But the truth behind this impossible birth was far more complex and emotionally charged than anyone could have imagined. Elias Thorne was a figure of imposing presence. At 38, he stood tall and broad-shouldered, his movements carrying a quiet strength honed by years of physical labor. His face, etched with the lines of sun and wind, held a perpetual expression of reserve. He was, in the eyes of many in the nearby town of Havenwood, an arrogant man. A man who held himself aloof, above the mundane concerns of everyday life. Driving through town in his battered pickup truck, Elias rarely acknowledged the greetings of his neighbors. He offered no smiles, no nods, no sign that he even registered their presence. This perceived coldness only served to solidify the rumors that swirled around him, painting him as a recluse, a man embittered by some unknown tragedy. But Elias hadn't always been this way. There was a time when his eyes held a spark of warmth, when his laughter echoed through the fields, when his heart was open to the simple joys of life. He had been, once, an easygoing man, surrounded by friends, full of dreams of the future he would build with his beloved wife, Clara. Back then, Elias believed happiness was a simple equation: love, a thriving farm, and the laughter of children running through the fields of Oakhaven. He and Clara were inseparable, two young souls intertwined, building a life together that seemed destined for enduring bliss. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. The first sign was subtle, almost insignificant. Clara mentioned a persistent ache, a dull throbbing that she initially dismissed as a consequence of her active life. But within weeks, the pain intensified, becoming impossible to ignore. They sought the counsel of doctors, specialists, anyone who could offer an explanation, a solution. The diagnosis struck Elias like a physical blow. Clara had cancer. The word hung in the air, heavy with dread, stealing the color from their vibrant world. Clara, ever the optimist, managed a weak smile. "We'll face it together, Elias," she said, her voice laced with a fragile determination. "We have everything we need: money, time, and each other." She tried to convince him, as much as herself, that they could conquer this insidious disease. Elias threw himself into the fight with a ferocity born of desperation. He spared no expense, consulting the best doctors, pursuing experimental treatments, traveling to renowned hospitals across the country. Each negative test result was met with a silent clenching of his fists, a refusal to accept that money, his hard-earned wealth, couldn't buy her life. But money, as he soon discovered, was no match for the relentless advance of the disease. In her final months, Clara was confined to her bed, her body ravaged by illness. Elias transformed one of the rooms in their house into a makeshift infirmary, tending to her needs with unwavering devotion. He sat by her side every night, holding her hand as she spoke of a future she knew she would never see. "Promise me you'll carry on, Elias," she whispered one night, her voice weak and raspy. "Promise me you won't shut yourself off from the world?" Elias made the promise, his voice thick with emotion. but it was a promise he never intended to keep. When Clara died, a part of Elias died with her. The pain consumed him, pulling him away from friends, from the town, from anything that reminded him of the vibrant life he had once known. He retreated into the solitude of Oakhaven Farm, surrounded only by his animals and the vast empty fields. Besides the animals, there was also Agnes Miller, a woman who came to the farm each day to clean the house and prepare meals. Agnes was a discreet woman, content to perform her duties in silence, avoiding any attempts at conversation with Elias. She understood that he preferred it that way. He wasn't rude to her, but he made no effort to be kind either. Agnes knew that Elias carried a heavy burden, a grief that he might never be able to share. She respected his space, allowing him the solitude he so desperately craved. That morning, as he rode through the fields on his usual routine, Elias felt the familiar pang of emptiness. The sky was clear, the air was fresh, but nothing seemed to fill the abyss that had opened in his soul. Reaching the crest of a hill, he paused, gazing at the house in the distance. It was a large, imposing structure, but as empty as he felt inside. He sighed, tightened the reins of his horse, Ranger, and began his descent. At that moment, he had no inkling that his life was about to be irrevocably changed, that the impossible was about to become reality. The days continued quietly on the farm, and Elias maintained his careful routine, with Goldie always attentive to any changes in her behavior. However, on that particular morning, something felt amiss. Elias awoke early, the clock showing just before 6 a.m. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen, where Agnes had already begun preparing the day's meals. He stretched, pulled on the boots he always left beside his bed, and headed straight for the kitchen. As he passed through the living room, he instinctively glanced at the corner where Goldie usually slept. Her bed was empty. It seemed strange, but he didn't worry right away. She must be around somewhere, he thought as he continued on. Entering the kitchen, he found Agnes at the table, finishing setting up breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, in her usual respectful tone. Elias nodded, sat down in his chair, and poured himself a cup of coffee. But something felt off. Normally, Goldie would already be by his side, lying at his feet, wagging her tail in anticipation, hoping for a scrap of bread or a pat on the head. He glanced toward the open kitchen door, expecting to see her appear, but the silence persisted. "Have you seen Goldie this morning, Agnes?" he finally asked. Agnes shook her head. "I haven't, Mr. Thorne. I thought she was with you." Elias frowned. It was unusual for Goldie not to show up in the morning. Even on her laziest days, she always greeted him when he woke up. He finished his coffee quickly and got up, determined to find her. He started in the yard, calling her name several times. Then he searched the rooms of the house, looking under furniture and behind doors, but there was no sign of the dog. Returning to the kitchen, he found Agnes watching him with a curious look. Could she have gone to hide because the birth is near? Animals usually look for a more private spot, she suggested, wiping her hands on her apron. Elias knew she was right. Goldie's natural instincts might have led her to seek a safer place to give birth. Still, he couldn't shake the tightness in his chest at the thought of her being alone and about to go into labor. He grabbed his hat, jammed his boots on more firmly than usual, and headed out to look for her. He began with the orchard, one of Goldie's favorite spots, but the area was empty. He called her name, hoping to hear at least a bark in response, but all he heard was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. He walked to the corral, peering between the fences, but nothing. Then an idea struck him. If Goldie wanted privacy, she had probably gone to the barn. Elias walked quickly toward the barn, his heavy steps marking the dirt path. The air seemed heavier as he approached, and an uneasy feeling began to build in his chest. He tried to dismiss the bad thoughts. "She just found a quiet spot," he murmured to himself, trying to convince himself. But his anxiety grew with every step. That's when he saw it. On the path leading to the barn, dark, irregular stains dotted the ground. Elias stopped, staring at the drops of blood. His heart pounded. They were fresh, recent, and the trail led straight to the barn's entrance. "Goldie?" he whispered, feeling his entire body tense. Without thinking twice, he started running. His hat fell off his head, but he didn't care. The drops continued all the way to the large wooden door, which was slightly ajar, as if it had been opened hastily. Elias pushed the door hard, making it creak, and stepped into the barn. His eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light filtering through the cracks. "Goldie?" His voice sounded rough, almost like a plea. In the farthest corner, on a bed of straw, was the dog. She was lying down, breathing heavily, surrounded by small, wiggling bodies. Elias took a step forward, relieved to realize that the puppies had been born and that Goldie seemed to be alive. But then, as he got closer, he saw something that made him freeze in his tracks. Among the puppies was something entirely out of the ordinary. Small, wrapped in pink skin, with arms and legs that moved slowly. Elias blinked, thinking his eyes were deceiving him, but it wasn't an illusion. It was a human baby. He stood motionless, his body rigid, as if struck by lightning. It was such a tiny baby that it could fit in the palm of his hand. It was lying next to the puppies as if it were one of them, and to Elias's astonishment, it seemed to be nursing from Goldie, who looked at it with the same tenderness she showed her own puppies. Elias's heart was pounding so fast it seemed to echo inside the barn. How was this possible? How could Goldie, his dog, have given birth to a human baby? He took another step forward, his hands now trembling, trying to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. This can't be real," Elias murmured to himself, his voice trembling. Slowly crouching, he examined the scene more closely. The puppies were there, all healthy. But that baby... Elias's mind was spinning with questions. Could this be some kind of cruel trick of nature? An unexplainable atrocity? He ran his hands through his hair, desperation overtaking him as his gaze remained fixed on the baby. Then, something at the back of the barn caught his attention, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Elias froze, his instincts on high alert. He grabbed the shotgun leaning against the nearby wall, lifting it cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but laced with nervousness. The barn fell silent, save for Goldie's labored breathing and the soft whimpers of the puppies. Elias took a step toward the dark corner, where stacks of hay and farming tools were piled up. Then he heard it, a muffled sound, like a sob. He pointed the shotgun, his eyes locked on the corner. "Who's there? Show yourself!" There was a moment of hesitation before something stirred behind a pile of hay. Elias felt sweat trickle down his forehead as a figure began to rise. It was a woman. She looked young, her face pale and her hair disheveled. She wore simple clothing stained with blood. Her hands trembled as she raised them in surrender. Her wide eyes were filled with fear. "Please," she murmured weakly. Elias stared at her, his breathing heavy. "Who are you? What are you doing here? Is that your baby?" he asked, his tone harsh, though his voice carried confusion and disbelief. The woman began to cry, her words broken by sobs. "Yes, it's mine," she replied shakily. She took a step forward but stopped immediately upon seeing the shotgun. "Please, I didn't mean to scare anyone. I didn't know what else to do." Elias remained motionless, trying to process the situation. He glanced at the baby, then back at the woman. "Did you give birth here, in my barn?" he asked, still not lowering the gun. She nodded slowly. I was running. I had nowhere else to go. I'm sorry." Silence filled the barn for what felt like an eternity. Elias lowered the gun slowly, his eyes still locked on her. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, but Elias also saw something else: exhaustion and desperation. "Running from what?" he asked, his voice now less rigid. She looked down, her quiet sobs continuing. "From my boyfriend," she whispered. Elias stared at her, processing her words. The blood stains on her clothes, her tear-reddened eyes, the constant trembling in her hands. It all screamed of a life in turmoil. "Running from your boyfriend," he repeated, his voice low, almost a whisper. She nodded, hugging herself tightly as if trying to shield herself from the words she was about to say. He used to beat me. He always said that when the baby was born, he'd throw her away." Her voice broke at the end. Elias felt a tightness in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was. Rage, sorrow, perhaps a mixture of both. He fully lowered the shotgun, leaning it against the barn wall, and took a step forward. The woman flinched instinctively, curling into herself like a cornered animal. "Calm down," he said, trying to sound gentler, though his voice still carried a natural hardness. "No one here is going to hurt you." She looked up at him hesitantly, gauging whether she could trust him. Elias nodded toward the baby, now peacefully sleeping alongside Goldie. "And what did you do? Leave your baby there with my dog? Why?" The woman began crying again, tears streaming uncontrollably. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go back home. He'd kill us both." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself enough to explain. "When I got here and gave birth, I saw your dog nursing her puppies. She looked so gentle, so welcoming. I thought maybe she could nurse my baby too. I just wanted him to have a chance, for someone to find him later and take care of him." Elias felt a lump form in his throat as he listened. He looked at Goldie again, licking the puppies and the baby with the same care, as though there were no difference between them. The sight was, in a way, incredibly moving, yet profoundly unsettling. "And what about you?" he asked, almost accusingly. "What do you think is going to happen to you if you go back?" She stared at the ground, her silent tears continuing to fall. "He'll kill me," she whispered, hugging herself tighter. She lifted her eyes to him, weary but filled with a quiet determination. "I don't care," she said, with a firmness that caught Elias off guard. "I just want him to be safe. That's all." For a moment, Elias said nothing. He was torn. Part of him, the pragmatic, hardened part shaped by life, wanted to walk away from all of it, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. After all, this wasn't his problem. But another part of him, a part he thought had died along with Clara, couldn't ignore the pain in the woman's voice or the desperation in her eyes. He sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You can't stay here," he said at last, his voice firm but not harsh. "This barn isn't a place for you or that baby." She started to say something, but he raised a hand, cutting her off. "Come with me. We're going into the house. I won't let you stay out here in the cold and dirt." The woman hesitated, looking at him as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. You're helping us?" "Yes, I am," Elias replied gravely. He took his coat and walked over to the baby, who was still sleeping peacefully. Gently, he wrapped the tiny body in the garment. For a moment, as he held the baby in his arms, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of warmth, of life. He shook his head, brushing the thought aside, and turned to the woman. "What's your name?" he asked, as she slowly approached. "Abigail," she said, her voice still trembling. "All right, Abigail," Elias said, beginning to walk out of the barn. "Let's go. You and your child will have some peace, at least for today." Abigail followed him, her steps slow and hesitant, as if she feared he might change his mind. But Elias didn't stop. He glanced back only once at Goldie, who was now surrounded by her puppies, calmly licking each one. When they reached the house, Agnes's eyes widened in shock as she saw Elias entering with Abigail and the baby in his arms. What's going on?" she asked, nearly dropping the kitchen towel she was holding. "I'll explain later," Elias said firmly. "Get some hot water and clean towels, and if you can find some of Clara's clothes that might fit her." Agnes gawped at him, but did as he asked. Abigail stood frozen in the doorway, as if unsure what to do. Elias looked at her and nodded toward the living room sofa. "Sit down. You look like you're about to collapse." She obeyed, sitting with hesitant movements, her hands nervously clasped. Elias carefully placed the baby on a blanket on the sofa. The tiny, pink and fragile body seemed to disappear into the soft fabric. His gestures were careful, and his watchful gaze reflected a seriousness that bordered on protective. When he was done, he looked up at Abigail, who was still trembling and visibly exhausted. "We'll take care of you and the baby first. Then we'll figure out what to do," he said, his voice firm but kind. Abigail nodded, her face still marked by fear, but now there was something new in her eyes. A spark of hope. Agnes, still trying to make sense of the situation, returned quickly with towels and an old outfit she had found in Clara's wardrobe. "She's going to need help bathing," she said, eyeing Abigail with the practiced look of someone who knew what needed to be done. "Let me take care of her, Mr. Thorne. You can look after the baby in the meantime." Elias hesitated for a moment, but soon nodded. He took the baby in his arms again, feeling the light weight and warmth of the tiny body. There was something almost surreal about holding such a fragile being. His large, calloused hands, shaped by years of farm work, had to move with a delicacy he hadn't realized he possessed. Agnes extended her hand to Abigail and helped her to her feet. "Come on, dear. I'll help you get cleaned up," she said in a maternal but firm tone. Abigail clung to her, and together they walked slowly toward the bathroom. Meanwhile, Elias stared at the baby in his arms, still trying to process everything that had happened. He walked to the kitchen sink, where he had already prepared a basin of warm water. "All right, little one," he murmured, more to himself than to the baby. "Time for a bath." He carefully placed the baby in the water, using a soft cloth to wash its delicate skin. The baby squirmed and made small noises, but didn't cry, which Elias took as a good sign. He didn't know much about babies, but he remembered Clara talking about how she dreamed of raising children on the farm, how much she loved the idea of building a family there. The thought tightened something in his chest. He shook his head, clearing his mind, and focused on the task, making sure the baby was clean and comfortable. On the other side of the house, Agnes was in the bathroom with Abigail. She had filled the tub with warm water and was holding Abigail by the arms, helping her step in slowly. "Child, I know you're weak, but you'll feel better after a bath," she said as Abigail nodded silently. "Thank you," Abigail murmured, tears welling in her eyes. "There's no need to thank me," Agnes replied as she gently wet Abigail's disheveled hair and ran a soft soap over her thin body, marked by exhaustion. "Mr. Thorne may seem rough, but he's a good man. You were lucky to end up here." Abigail didn't respond, but there was relief in her eyes, something Agnes noticed. When she finished helping her, she dried Abigail carefully and handed her clean clothes. "All done. Get dressed and then we'll go see your baby," she said, waiting patiently as Abigail finished getting ready. A few minutes later, Agnes led her to the living room. The soft sound of the baby's breathing reached Abigail's ears before they even entered. When they arrived, Elias was sitting in a chair, cradling the baby in his arms. The infant was wrapped in a clean blanket and looked peaceful, eyes closed, sleeping deeply. Abigail paused in the doorway, watching the scene, her lips trembling with emotion. Elias looked up at her. "He's fine, a strong boy from what I can tell," he said, trying to ease the atmosphere. Abigail nodded, overwhelmed. She walked over slowly, extending her arms. Elias hesitated for a moment before handing over the baby with almost reverent care. When she held the baby against her chest, an expression of pure love and relief washed over her face. At that moment, the sound of an engine in the distance signaled the arrival of the private doctor Elias had called. Elias stood and went to the door to greet him, quickly explaining the situation. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, entered and began examining Abigail and the baby immediately. Fortunately, the baby was born healthy and the mother is simply exhausted. With some nutritious soup, rest, and care, they'll both be fine, the doctor said. Elias nodded, feeling a sense of relief he didn't realize he needed. After the doctor left, he turned to Abigail, who was lying in bed with the baby in her arms, her eyes beginning to close from exhaustion. "You'll stay here," he said firmly, "at least until you're strong enough to decide what to do." Abigail looked up at him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias averted his gaze, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gratitude. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, walking toward the kitchen to check if Agnes had finished preparing the soup. He didn't know how, but he felt that somehow his life had just changed forever.